Okay, what does the Marginalist Revolution refer to? What it indicates is a simultaneous discovery back in the early 1870s of a principle that underlies pretty much all of economics today. The term marginal utility, as we'll see, refers to satisfaction. Okay, there's different, initially at least, different ways or different terms that were used to denote this concept. There were three co-discoverers, people who worked independently and came up with this principle. Now, this principle was developed to solve a problem that had long bedeviled economics. Classical economists, and by the classical economists I mean Adam Smith, David Hume, and David Ricardo, and I'll put their names up in a moment, were stumped by the following problem. They looked on the market and they saw that diamonds had an extremely high price on the one hand. On the other hand, bread had a relatively low price, especially compared to diamonds, okay? Pound for pound, especially compared to bread. Pound for pound, diamonds were much more expensive than bread. What puzzled them was the fact that bread was really an essential of human life, okay? Especially back in the 19th century and in the 18th century, when some of them were writing at the end of the 18th century, bread sustained life. Well, diamonds, on the other hand, were something that were, a bauble, a trivial adornment on one's person, and yet had a high price on the market. Okay, it wasn't something that was essential to human life, so they could not solve this problem. We'll go through a little bit about how classical economists approached the problem of value. But what they did then was to say, well, this is a paradox, and we'll put use value aside for the moment, the fact that bread is so much more useful than diamonds. Okay? And so they went on to explain the high market value or exchange value of diamonds by simply pointing out that it costs a great deal more to produce a diamond than it did to produce a loaf or a pound of bread. Okay, so that was their solution. But as we'll see in a moment, that really left some holes in the economic theory that they developed. So there were three co-discoverers, as I mentioned, and this is one of the times in intellectual history. Another example, by the way, was calculus, which was discovered by Newton and, I can't remember, Leibniz about the same time and independently. Carl Menger was an Austrian economist, and as we'll see, he's the founder of the Austrian School of Economics. He wrote a book in 1871 in which he put forth this principle of marginal utility as an explanation for value, for exchange value. William Stanley Jevons was a British economist who wrote a book in 1871 also in which he came up with the doctrine of what he called final utility, which again referred to this concept of marginal utility. Menger himself never gave the concept a name. Okay? Carl Menger used very long Germanic sentences to describe what he was talking about, but he never named the concept. It was named later by one of his followers, Ludwig von Mises, who called it Grenznutzen, which translated is marginal utility. Finally, a Swiss-French economist, Leon Walras, wrote a book in 1874, and again, he was working independently of Jevons and Menger, hadn't seen their works, and came up with the same concept, which he called rarité, okay, in French. Now, we're going to focus on Menger and Menger's development of the concept for a very important reason. Both Jevons and Walras conceived of marginal utility, which refers to satisfaction, as some sort of quantity that was subject to arithmetical operations. Okay, it could be added, multiplied, and so on. Okay, Menger, on the other hand, conceived of marginal utility as the outcome of an individual actor's judgment about how important a particular good was to that actor and how it compared to the importance of other goods that he had a chance to obtain or that he already owned. Menger went far beyond that. He used this concept to develop a complete and realistic theory of price. Okay? And this price theory became the centerpiece of the Austrian School of Economics. So what Menger basically was trying to do was to take subjective value, an individual choice, and integrate it with the objective prices that we saw on the market and which directed production by business decision makers and, and firms and so on. Okay? And in doing this, he did create the Austrian School of Economics. He also, as we'll see, originated the correct method for doing research in theoretical economics. Now, let me give you a few quotes by very prominent historians of thought about Carl Menger. Joseph Schumpeter, who wrote a very large and important book on the history of economics, wrote, and I'm quoting here, "Menger is nobody's pupil, and what he created stands. Menger's theory of value, price, and distribution is the best we have up to now." That was written in the mid-1920s. Okay, Menger had written in 1871. Ludwig von Mises wrote, quote, "What is known as the Austrian School of Economics started in 1871 when Carl Menger published a slender volume under the title Principles of Economics. Until the end of the 70s, and I'm still quoting Mises here, so he's talking about the 1870s, until the end of the 70s, there was no Austrian school. There was only Carl Menger." Finally, Friedrich Hayek, who won the Nobel Prize in 1974, wrote, "The Austrian school's fundamental ideas belong fully and wholly to Carl Menger. What is common to the members of the Austrian school, what constitutes their peculiarity and provided the foundations for their later contributions, is their acceptance of the teaching of Carl Menger." Okay? Now, Menger's aim was not to overthrow the classical school of economics. It's sometimes thought that he was a revolutionary, and it is called the Marginalist Revolution, who was out to completely crush classical economics and replace it with a completely new system. That wasn't the case. He respected many of the things, the conclusions of the classical school. Okay? What he wanted to do, okay, the classical school came up with a pretty good theory of price determination in the short run. That is, supply and demand, as we'll see, determines price. But what he wanted to do was to link the subjective values, okay, how people, or what people's attitudes were towards various goods, okay, their preferences and their choices. He wanted to link the subjective preferences with the objective prices that directed the overall economy, okay. This is what the classical economists failed to do, okay, for various reasons. Remember, the classical economists believed that cost of production determined price. Okay. Of course, the classical economists could not explain why last year GM lost $10.6 billion, right? I mean, if costs determine prices, well, you simply set your price high enough that you cover your costs and you have a return, a normal return on your investment. Okay, so if costs really determine prices, no firms would ever lose any money. But of course, if a firm loses $10.6 billion, it means that the things that they produced, they sold for a lower price on the market than their cost of production. Okay? Menger saw this. He was an economic journalist before he became an economist. And he watched the markets and he said, you know what? He says, prices aren't determined this way. Prices are changing from day to day, especially on commodities markets and stock markets and so on. Okay? Prices on a given day have very little to do with the cost of producing the good. Okay? So he began to work on this book, The Principles of Economics, and in doing so, he developed the principle of marginal utility. Now, what was so unique about Menger's contribution was that, well, actually, let me just, before I get into Menger, let me just mention what the good things that the classical economists did. Okay, and by the classical economists, I am referring to, as I mentioned before, and I'll put their names up here. I think I have them here. Or maybe not. Let me just write them out for you. Okay, this is what the classical economists could not solve, the paradox of value. Okay, Adam Smith, whose famous book, The Wealth of Nations, was published in 1776. Okay, actually, one of his predecessors, David Hume, contemporaries, but Hume actually wrote many of his economic contributions before Smith during the 1750s. And the follower of Smith, okay, David Ricardo. Who wrote in the first 2 decades of the 19th century. Okay. When did Ricardo's book come out, Mark? Do you know offhand? think it may have been 1811, but I'm not sure about that. Those were the classical economists. And classical economics lasted from, if we date it back to Adam Smith's great book, which many people do, 1776 to 1870s. Okay. And as the story goes, it was in the 1870s that these marginal revolutionaries overthrew the classical school. But what I do want to mention to you is that the classical school did some good things, and Karl Menger's intention was to complete their system, okay, to fill in the gaps and the holes in their system. One of the things that the classical economists pointed out was that prices were not determined by historical accident, okay. That is that, they were just uncaused phenomena that we sort of observe in the real world. Right? They were like lightning storms or something like that. No, they were not caused by accident. Okay? Nor were they set by sellers. Okay? Nor could the sellers simply and arbitrarily set prices at whatever level they wanted to. The classical school pointed out that at least in the short run, supply and demand, okay, which is an immutable universal law of economics, determined price. They also pointed out that prices, including not only output prices, that is the prices of consumers' goods, but also wage rates, interest rates, and so on, those prices were used by businessmen to make their decisions about how much to produce, what type of technology to use, where to locate production, what types of goods to produce. Okay? So in other words, the classical school pointed out that prices regulated production. Production itself was not chaotic or anarchic, as Karl Marx later pointed out under capitalism. Okay? In fact, it was strictly regulated by entrepreneurs, firms, and so on, calculating their costs and their prices. Okay? Comparing output prices with costs. Trying to lower their input prices or lower their costs as much as possible, that is, to use the best possible technology, to produce goods which had the highest prices that consumers would pay. Just to give you an example, when people in the late 1980s, early 1990s began to demand SUVs, the price of SUVs shot up. So what do we see? Almost immediately, okay, after, for example, the Dodge Caravan was introduced. Okay, well, actually, this was before SUVs. This was when we had when people were moving away from station wagons. They were looking. You had the soccer mom phenomenon, okay, in which women were ferrying their families around, their kids around, and they needed larger automobiles, and they didn't really want to, drive in these clunky old station wagons. So we began to get these sorts of cars. So what happened was the prices shot up, so different companies began to produce these. Companies that were already producing them increased the production. The reason being that prices now rose a great deal above the cost of production, causing high profits in this area. Okay? So other types of cars were discontinued. You saw station wagons, the production being completely eliminated. Okay, I don't think you can find one nowadays. And the movement was towards these sort of Dodge Caravan type cars. Later on, people wanted more sporty looks, a little bit more power, and the demand for SUVs rose. And again, we got high profits. Entrepreneurs responded to that by producing more of these cars, and now we see, half the vehicles on the road are probably SUVs of some type. Okay. On the other hand, if people did not like a particular good, back in the 1970s or late 70s, early 80s, when we had oil prices shooting up for the first time, Americans began to shift away from large gas-guzzling family sedans towards compact and subcompact cars. The American automobile industry did not respond, and they began to lose money. So GM, Chrysler almost went out of business. The government had to bail them out in 1981. GM, Chrysler, and Ford lost $5 billion in 1 year, okay, altogether. Okay. And compare that, by the way, to what GM lost last year, $10.6 billion. But in any case, they were forced to downsize their cars. Why? Because the Japanese firms were making high profits by selling compact and subcompact cars here in the U.S. So resources, again, shifted out of the low profit areas which were producing goods that were not as useful to consumers, into higher profit areas. The classical school understood this process, and they delineated the process. They set it out. But their theory was restricted to the businessman. Okay? They didn't talk about demand. They only had a theory of supply, how supply adjusted to changes in prices and profits. Okay. Now, what was the source of the problem? Okay, why did they have this problem? The reason why the classical school had a deficient or flawed theory of economics was that they focused on broad categories of goods. Let me explain that. They took bread as a whole, as I mentioned before. They took diamonds as a whole. Okay? They took abstract classes of goods, not individual concrete units. And they tried to make statements about these abstract classes. They tried to theorize about them. They said things like diamonds aren't as useful to human beings as bread is, yet they have a higher price. So they fell into this, what they thought was an insoluble paradox of value. Okay, they couldn't resolve this paradox of value. Why should something that is more useful to human beings have a lower price on the market? Okay, they couldn't figure that out. Okay. Now, what they did was, the problem was they split value into two. They said, well, there's use value, how important a thing is to a human being. And before anything can be a good and can be bought and sold on the market, it has to have some use value. But we're not going to really worry about that. Okay, we really can't explain that. So we're just going to assume that whatever's exchanged on the market has some use value. We're only going to try to explain the second category of value, exchange value. Exchange value was what something would exchange for on the market, the amount of money that something would get you on the market. So what they did was they split value theory in two. Okay, so that was one of the flaws. And they tried to explain exchange value, as I mentioned before, by cost of production. Now, what that meant to them was that value was inherent in a good. If somehow, in some sense, think of it this way, if somebody sweat a lot while making a good, then that had greater value than if laborers were able to produce a good more easily. Okay? So some clever historian of thought pointed out that it was sort of a sweat theory of value. The more you sweat in producing something, the higher value it had to have. So the value of a good didn't come from consumers. They pushed consumers aside. They couldn't explain use value. The value came from the production process itself, meaning that it was measured by the number of labor hours, to some economists such as David Ricardo, or to Adam Smith, by the amount or the monetary cost of producing it. So diamonds had a high price because it took a lot of labor hours to get a 1-carat diamond to the surface and turn it into a gem quality jewel. Okay. Whereas on the other hand, it didn't take as many labor hours, or it didn't cost as much money, whichever you preferred, to produce the wheat that then was ground into flour, that then was turned into bread, that then was sold to consumers. Okay. So they assume that value went from the producer's goods to the consumer goods. Okay. Now, they couldn't explain a lot of things here, right? How could they explain the value of a painting by Da Vinci? Or to use a more modern example, a baseball card sold on eBay a few years ago, a baseball card from 1910 or so, Honus Wagner, famous American baseball player, that card sold for $600,000. Certainly didn't cost $600,000 to produce that baseball card. Okay. The lyrics to I Am the Walrus, written by John Lennon and Paul McCartney, but actually it was John Lennon's song, the song the Beatles sang. The lyrics that were handwritten by John Lennon on the back of an envelope sold on eBay for $40,000. It didn't cost them $40,000 to come up with those lyrics. Okay? They couldn't explain that. So what they did was they took a whole class of goods and they called them scarcity goods. And they said, well, that's explained by supply and demand. Well, that's actually the correct explanation. Okay? The other goods, okay, what they call reproducible goods, automobiles, McDonald's hamburgers, the equipment we have, the audio equipment we have up here, and so on. All of those things can be produced and reproduced. Therefore, in the long run, they claim, not in the short run, they claim, in the long run, cost of production determine the price. Okay? So not only did they split value theory, they split price theory. So they didn't have one explanation for all prices and values. Now that was what Carl Menger aimed to do, to substitute a unitary or unified value and price theory for the dichotomized, something that's split in two, the dichotomized value and price theory of the classical school. What were some of the implications of the classical theory of value and price? Well, it implied that when you had exchange, the two things exchanged had to be equal in value. They both had to have cost the same amount of money. Okay? Well, why would, you can ask yourself the question, why would someone exchange something with someone else if what he was getting in return had the same value as what he was giving away? It made no sense. Why would anyone do that? Generally, I mean, if we just reflect on our own experience, okay, we're happy when we walk away from an exchange. And so is the other person. The reason why we're happy, okay, and Carl Menger figured this out, we'll talk about it in more technical detail, the reason why we're happy is because we've given away something that to us has less use value than what we're getting in exchange. We're getting in exchange something that we believe will improve our lives more than the thing that we gave away. Okay, whether it's a sum of money or it's a good. The seller or the person on the other side of the transaction feels exactly the same way, otherwise she would not make the transaction. Okay, secondly, classical schools, since they could not explain use value, concentrated only on the businessman. And this fed into the Marxist critics of capitalism, because they pointed out that the businessman is someone who only wants to buy the low price, okay, buy the factors of production, the inputs at a low price, and then sell at a high price. In Latin, this was called homo economicus, the economic man. Okay, but we know people are not just motivated by the highest possible profit that they can earn. They're motivated by other things. Okay, in fact, as we'll see, they're motivated by a complex mixture of different goals. Okay. Someone has to make a decision whether they should work extra hours or stay at home and donate their time to a church. That is, whether they should earn money income, they compare the money income they're earning against donating time to a church, let's say, or spending more time with their children. So altruistic, or not even want to use the term altruistic, motives are very complex. There's no such thing as a purely economic motive. But again, even though the classical economists understood that, there was no way to work that into their theory. Okay, so what they did say was that homo economicus is not a representative of, doesn't represent a real person in any sense. Homo economicus, economic man, is only hypothetical. So economic laws, according to them, do not hold completely in the real world. There's a tendency for them to hold, okay, for them for those laws to explain any situation. Okay. There are other, what they call frictions, that prevent those laws from operating completely. Also, they focus on the long run and they neglected the short run. But of course, human beings live in the immediate run. We have actions take place at every moment in time. We have to explain the results of those actions, okay, at every moment. We can't say in the long run this is going to tend to happen. That's not a full economic explanation. The long run is important, but the long run starts in the short run, or even in the immediate run. Okay. Finally, they couldn't understand the full significance of monetary calculation, that is, the calculation that they were talking about. Business decision makers calculating their profits and losses, and then adjusting their actions accordingly. Okay. They took for granted that there was property, private property, they took for granted that there was money, and so on. Okay, because they didn't focus on consumers, they didn't go outside of that framework to see how all of these institutions evolved. And that was another problem. Okay, now how did Menger complete the classical system? Give us a full and realistic theory of economics that was completely applicable at every moment to the real world. Well, first of all, he had a different starting point. Okay? Menger, in notes that he wrote to himself while he was preparing his book, The Principles of Economics, I'll put the two quotes up here because they're very worthy of note. He said, man himself is the beginning and the end of every economy. That is, the consumer is the beginning and the end of every economy. He also said, Our science is a theory of a human being's ability to deal with his wants. No word there about the businessman. The businessman isn't the basis of economics. Okay. The businessman grows up in response to human wants. Okay. So, if I can find my, there we go. Okay, those middle two sentences. Man himself is the beginning and the end of every economy, and our science is the theory of a human being's ability to deal with his wants. All things are subject to the law of cause and effect. Okay, that's the first line of his text, by the way. That's actually a third sentence that should be separated a little bit more. It's the very first line of his book. All things are subject to the law of cause and effect. Now, what he meant by that was the following. And I'll give you the notes that he wrote to himself. Okay, it's pretty short. Let's see if I have it here. He wrote, in notes in preparing the book, he wrote wants, efforts, satisfaction. He also wrote ends, means, and something like satisfaction. There was a third phrase I wanted to get here to you. Let's see. Yeah. Ends means, actually he wrote realization, meaning as in realizing the end, bringing it about. And see, the third thing that he wrote was personality. Missed it again. What he was trying to tell us was this, that the law of causality works. People's wants stimulate them or cause them to exert efforts, okay, so wants to efforts, subjective to the objective efforts they make in production, okay, and then the production itself, the goods that are produced through these efforts, in turn, bring about or cause satisfaction. So we go from the subjective state of people having wants or feeling uneasy about their situation and wanting to improve their situation. We go from that to them making efforts in the real world to bring about satisfaction of those wants. So we go from subjective, causing the objective production, which in turn brings about subjective satisfaction. Ends means the same thing. There are human ends. People have various goals. They want to send their children to college. They want to get a bigger house. They want to help their church. They want to spend more time with friends and so on. So they have all of these ends that are conflicting. They're scarce means. So they use those means in a way that will bring about the realization of those ends that are most important to them. Menger got all of this from a 19th century economist, Frederick Bastiat, a free market French economist. Bastiat used this trinity, wants, efforts, satisfaction. So the key thing was that Menger had the right starting point. Man is the beginning and end of every economy, meaning man's wants. Okay? And he used the correct method. Okay? The correct method then was to start with human wants. A want, by the way, is not a desire. Okay? If you go back and look at the etymology, a want is a lack of something. Human beings are imperfect beings. We're incomplete. Okay? That is why at every conscious moment we're always striving to better ourselves. Okay? From our own point of view, not from someone else's. We might say, oh, that person's going to hell, or that person is destroying his or her life. Okay? We don't make any ethical judgments as economists. what we're saying is that an individual is always attempting to better themselves from their own point of view, to use their scarce resources, these objective elements of their environment, and to transform them into things that give them more satisfaction. Okay. Now, let's go to the next concept that Menger brought up. Okay, he was very methodical in developing, unfolding his economics. He said, you know what? The classical school took goods for granted. They said these things are goods, these things are not goods. But he went further. He said, what exactly is a good? What are the preconditions for a thing in the objective world to become a good? To become something which people strive to obtain in order to satisfy their wants. And he came up with a pretty good definition. Okay, it was a little bit flawed, and Ludwig von Mises later corrected it. He said, before anything can become a good, there has to be a need. All right, I'm hungry. Okay? That's a human need. Okay? Or a want. I lack food or sustenance. 2, he said, there has to be, the thing that we're talking about has to have properties that render it capable of being brought into a causal relationship or connection with the satisfaction of this need. Simply put, it means that, let's say, a ham sandwich is something that I recognize as satisfying that need if I'm hungry. He says there also has to be human knowledge of this causal connection. I have to know that a ham sandwich will satisfy my need for food or my want for food. Finally, he said there has to be command of the thing. You have to have control of the thing, which is sufficient to direct it to the satisfaction of the need. Okay? I have to have it. I have to own that ham sandwich. If you have it in your hand and are about to consume it, okay, then it is not a good for me. Okay? It's a good for you. I don't have control of the thing. All right, now let's. So something that such as bread is a good. But what about petroleum? Okay, in the 18th century. Well, we know that there was a human need for heat and light. Okay, and we know that there's some sort of objective causal connection between petroleum and satisfying the need that people have for fuel and for heat and for light and so on. But human beings in the 18th century didn't have this knowledge, okay, which is one of the 4 preconditions. Right? So in that case, petroleum wasn't a good, even though it was there right under the surface of the earth, waiting to be tapped and to satisfy human wants. Because the technology hadn't developed, it was not yet a good. Or let's say you want to go to, let's say, a baseball game. You want to go see the Braves play. I don't know why. Fallen so far behind the Mets. But in any case, you need a sunny day to complete that. Okay, you have to have a sunny day, or a day at least where there's no rain. Okay, but a sunny day, no matter how much it would please you, because that's one of the complementary goods that goes into creating the experience of a baseball game. If you have rain, you can't have the game. No one controls the sun. No one controls the sun. So no matter how satisfying it may be to human beings, we don't have control or command of the sun. So the sun is not a good for us. Okay? It's not a good. Now, what was the mistake that was made by Menger in setting out those 4 conditions? Well, people use remedies all the time that don't cure their whatever illness they might have. Okay, people go to quacks. Okay, people buy things that they later on realize they hate. Someone might buy a motorcycle and then get caught in the rain a few times and say, "Geez, I wish I never made that expenditure. This thing is worthless to me." Okay, and so on. So what von Mises pointed out is that 2 and 3, that is that there has to be some sort of objective connection between the thing and the satisfaction of the need and human knowledge of this causal connection. Those 2 things can be replaced by the simple statement that there has to be an opinion or a belief that a thing has the capacity to satisfy human wants. Okay? It doesn't actually have to satisfy human wants because people are always operating in a world of uncertainty. They are prone to error, and they in fact do make errors. Okay? That does not mean they won't pay a high price for things that they later find out then do not satisfy them. So we could not explain prices of things that later turn out to be not useful to the people who are purchasing them, if we did not replace it with the precondition with a belief, okay, that it can satisfy our wants. By the way, Menger actually recognized this, and later he said, well, there's such thing as imaginary goods. Okay, because there are imaginary goods. They're not really goods because they don't actually satisfy our needs, but people are willing to pay prices for them. Well, in fact, it's a good. Okay, you or I might judge that it's not satisfying that person's need, but that person's willing to pay a price for it. So at that point in time, it is a good for that person. Well, Menger went even further, and he said there are some things like air and water in situations where there's people live near huge streams of fresh water, air and water in which there's more than enough to satisfy all human needs. Okay. And a loss of 1 cubic foot of air would not lower anybody's welfare. He says, well, that's a good, but it's not an economic good. So for something to be an economic good, and therefore to command the price or an exchange value, it not only must meet those 4 preconditions, but it also must be insufficient to satisfy all human wants. Okay? So, for example, air in a normal situation is not a good. It's not a good for us. Despite the fact that we couldn't live without it for more than 3 or 4 minutes, it is not a good. The reason being that there's more than enough to satisfy all our wants. So that none of us, think about it, none of us consciously strive to get enough air. In the same way we strive to get more automobiles, more swimming pools, more Arby's roast beef sandwiches, and so on. Okay. So it has no exchange value. Now we'll explain, as we'll see, Menger explained this. Okay. Now, is it true that air, if you're a diver, okay, if you're a deep sea diver, has no value? No. In that case, air does have value. It is an economic good. You will pay a high price for tanks of oxygen. Okay. Okay. All right, so we're at the point now where Menger wants to explain how value arises from human wants. And this is where he comes up with his famous principle of marginal utility, again, though he did not use that term. What we're going to do is to show, let me first enunciate the law. What Menger said is the following, and I'm only paraphrasing here. Basically, the law of marginal utility tells us the following. As the quantity of a good possessed by an individual increases, that is, we get more units of apples or more units as we get more cars and so on, its marginal utility, now marginal in this sense means additional, okay? Its marginal utility simply means satisfaction, falls. Okay, so the marginal utility of the third automobile, if they're all interchangeable, is lower than the second automobile. And therefore, the value of an automobile to that individual is lower. Okay? Now, the example he used, and it was a very clever example. Okay? It's actually not the example so much as the question that he asks, is the following. Okay? He uses the mythical character, or the fictional character, excuse me, of Robinson Crusoe, who is, in the book, shipwrecked on an island, okay? All he has is his own labor and the natural resources that are available to him on the island. And he has many wants, okay? As we'll see, human wants really are unlimited. The reason why we know human wants are unlimited is because, as I mentioned before, at every moment of consciousness, we are continually using means to achieve ends, okay? Whether you're sitting here listening to this lecture, whether you're eating lunch later on, whether you're driving a car, you're always doing it for a purpose. And that purpose, in general, is always to improve your situation, or the situation as it will develop in the future, okay? Because actions always take time. So any action is always directed towards the future. It might be the immediate future, but it's always directed towards the future. So in your mind, you say, if I undertake this action now, I will be better off in the future than if I do not undertake this action, or if I undertake another action. So people are always acting. And because they're always acting, what does that reveal to us? That reveals to us that they're incomplete, they're imperfect. They're striving to improve their welfare. Okay? We cannot even think of a person who's conscious and who is not acting. Okay, now Robinson Crusoe then has a number of wants. What Menger pointed out was that the wants for any good, okay, are individual wants. So he talked about concrete units of goods. He didn't talk about all the bread in the world, or all the diamonds, or all the water, okay, or all the game on the island. Let's say there's deer and so on the island. What he talked about was specific wants for concrete units of the good. Now let's talk about bread for a moment. Let's say that he has harvested some grain. Okay, he's become a farmer on this island, and this is a scale of wants for a sack of grain. His most important want is to transform the grain, okay, by turning it into flour and then baking it into bread. And that first sack of bread, or the first sack of grain, is enough to provide bread that will sustain his life for the next year, or until the next harvest. Okay, if he had a second sack of wheat, it would provide enough bread to maintain his health and vitality. That is, if he just had enough bread to sustain his life, he would still be sickly. He wouldn't be able to do much on the island. But the second sack of wheat will then allow him to produce even more bread that makes him healthy and vital and so on. The third sack will be to extend his life beyond next year. That is, he'll use it for seed grain, okay, because the wheat itself, the grains are used as seeds, and that will provide him a harvest for next year, so that it will extend his life into the future. Fourth sack is, I think he used brandy, but it's for the production of whiskey. Actually, I like vodka better, so vodka. Fifth is feed for farm animals. Okay, he wants to vary his diet, so he would use the fifth sack, if he had it, to feed chickens and cows, so he could have poultry products and dairy and meat and so on. Okay. The sixth, I meant to put a sixth in here, and he actually did. It actually be a feed for parrots, so he has some company. He's a lonely guy. Okay, he actually did have that as a sixth want. Okay, and there are many, many wants for these sacks of wheat. But let's stop there. So let's say for the now, Menger asked the following question, and this is a brilliant insight. It's a brilliant way of proceeding. He said, "What is the value of a sack of grain to Robinson Crusoe? Is it the satisfaction he gets from the most important end served by a sack of grain, which is the first end? Or is it the average of all 5 ends? Does he average them up and then divide by 5? Okay, let's say he has 5 sacks of wheat now. He's harvested 5 sacks of wheat. Okay? Well, you can't add and divide utility, as we'll see, or satisfaction, because there is no unit. There's no unit of measurement for satisfaction. So the question Menger asked was the following. If, and let me just embellish it a little bit, if a fox or family of foxes broke into where he was storing this wheat, okay, he just harvested it, he's ready to use it, he's marked the sacks. By the way, they're all interchangeable, same grade of wheat. The 5th sack could serve the first end, the 2nd sack could serve the 3rd end, okay? They're interchangeable, so they're identical. So if these foxes then devoured one of the sacks, let's say they devour sack number 2, okay? Would he go without bread? Oh, no, of course not. He wouldn't go out without bread. What would he do? He would always, if he lost a sack, what end would he forego? The least important end that the supply of the good serves. What is the least important end? If your supply is 5, the least important end is maintaining farm animals. If he happens to have 6 and the fox eats one of them, no matter which one the fox devours, he's going to give up the parrot. He'll never give up a higher end at the expense of a lower end. That is, for Menger, everyone economized their resources. they always use their resources for the highest valued ends. So if you had only 4 sacks, you would only serve ends 1 through 4. Okay? Now for Menger then, what he called it was, the way he phrased it was the following. He said that he would give up the least important end that was dependent on a sack of grain. Okay? So sometimes it was called dependent utility. Okay? Because that word dependent was used a lot by a Menger. But so the marginal utility then is the least important end, okay, that can be achieved by the supply of the good. Because, and that determines the value of the good. No matter which 5 you lose, what satisfaction do you lose? Which of the 5? Okay? The 5th one. So the value of any sack of wheat is determined by its marginal utility. The marginal utility is the expected satisfaction from having meat and milk and chicken during the year. That's what he gives up. Okay? That's what he gives up. And that is the value. It's not the highest ranked end. So Menger solved the paradox of value. Why is it that bread, which is so much more useful to human beings as an abstract class, has a much lower market price than diamonds, which is much less useful to human beings? Because in a normal situation, the marginal utility of bread, because it's so much more abundant relative to people's wants than diamonds, the marginal utility of bread is lower than what? The marginal utility of diamonds. If you're in a desert and you have the that perfect purple, I think it was 11-carat diamond that cost whatever it was maybe 2 or 3-carat diamond rather, that Kobe Bryant bought for his wife when he was caught in an act of infidelity a few years ago, the American basketball player. I think it cost $11 million or something like that. So you have this diamond in your pocket, but you haven't had water for 3 days. You're stranded in the desert. Somebody comes up with a quart of water, and I don't know, human being can go 3 to 5 days without water. Would you trade the diamond for the water? In that situation, you certainly would, because the water serves a higher end than the diamond does. In that case, water is so scarce that the end served by a quart of water has more value to the individual who have not had water in 3 days than the end served by that diamond. So simply by changing the relative supplies of goods, you can see that thinking in terms of abstract classes is a dead end. You have to think about concrete units and the wants that people have for different goods. So Menger completely solved or solved satisfactorily the the paradox of value. Now, by the way, and you can see how the law applies. If the less of the good, or the lower the quantity of the good the person possesses, the higher the marginal utility, and therefore the higher the value. So if he only harvested 3 sacks of grain, then the marginal utility of a sack of wheat is higher, and therefore so is its value. Because now it's the grain for the next year's harvest, which is going to extend his life for a year, that depends on that sack. Okay? Any of those 3 sacks, if one of them is lost, he has to give up then a harvest for next year, which has a higher utility than the vodka. Okay? So the less we have of a good, the higher its marginal utility, that is, the higher the last satisfaction that we get, and therefore the higher the value. Now let me just change the situation a little bit and talk about 2 goods. Okay? Because we're always comparing marginal utilities of various goods when we make our choices in everyday life about what to purchase. Okay? This is a law that explains our moment-to-moment actions in the real world. Let's say you have a farmer, okay, and he has 3 horses and 2 cows. The 3 horses are identical to one another. The 2 cows are identical to one another. However, they cannot be used for the same ends. Okay? Horse can't give milk. The cow can't be ridden. Okay? So they're 2 different goods. All right, let's say this is a scale of wants. Okay? The first horse he'd use for plowing his field. That gives him the highest utility. Second would also make it easier for him to plow if he hitched 2 horses to the plow. The third end is served by the cow's milk. Fourth by the second cow, which would give enough milk for cheese and butter. And then the 5th would be by the 3rd horse that he has pleasure riding. Which animal has higher value to him? Which is the more valuable animal? Before you answer that, you ask a simple question that Menger asks. if the barn is on fire and you can only save 4 of the 5 animals, which animal do you leave in the barn? You leave the horse, because pleasure riding is the lowest ranked end. Thanks. Okay? So a horse in this situation, even though it serves the highest ranked end, 1 unit of the horse, a horse has a lower value than the cow. Okay? Why? Because in losing 1 horse, you give up a less satisfying end. Now, if he does lose that horse, what happens? Which animal becomes more valuable now? The horse becomes more valuable. Why? Because the marginal utility is now the satisfaction that he expects to get from easing the burden of plowing by hitching the horse to the plow. So values of goods can change depending on their supplies. Okay, what else did Menger? What were some of Menger's other accomplishments? Menger came up with something or a concept that he called orders of goods. Okay, I'm going to show this very quickly. What Menger pointed out was that production takes place in stages. Okay, before you can produce bread, you have to have at retail stores. You have to have bread at wholesale. Okay, you have to have a distributor for the bread. But before you can have a distributor for the bread, you must have flour. Okay, before you can have the flour, you must have the wheat. And actually, there's more. Before you can have the wheat, you must have farm tools, okay, and structures and so on. Before you can have the farm tools and structures, there's even another order of goods. You have to have iron ore. So you have to have an iron mine and so on to make these various tools. So what Menger pointed out was this, that goods that are further away from consumers he called higher order goods. Production always proceeds from the higher order goods to the lowest order or the final good. The final good is the consumer good, which when consumed provides the service of satisfying the human want. So production goes from the top to the bottom, goes from higher order goods to lower order goods. The classical school made the mistake of thinking that it was the value of the higher order goods of the wheat that gave value to the bread. Menger said no. He came up with something called the theory of imputation. Okay? Okay, that's a fancy word. All it means is that the value of goods are imputed backwards. Okay, so production goes this way, value goes this way. The bread at retail stores is only valuable because human beings believe that bread satisfies an important want, okay, or certain wants that they have. And therefore, the consumer's good has value. But if bread didn't have any value, flour wouldn't have any value. Why would people value flour if they thought that bread didn't satisfy any wants? Well, they would not. Okay? So value for Menger is imputed backwards. It's imputed from the consumer's good up to the higher order goods. So let's take an extreme example, which I give my undergraduates when I teach this. Let's say that for some reason people became, or let me take the movie Witness. The movie Witness with Harrison Ford, which takes place in southeastern Pennsylvania among the Amish. The Amish religion is such that people don't even wear buttons. They wear absolutely no adornment or ornamentation on any of their clothing. Okay, they have hooks to keep their clothing closed. So they don't wear buttons because they think it's vain and so on. So obviously they don't wear any jewelry. So gem quality diamonds have no value to these people. Now, what if everyone took on these values? What would happen to the value of diamonds? Value of diamonds, forgetting about their industrial uses, value of diamonds would fall to zero. What would happen to the high salaries that jewelers get, that very skilled jewelers get? Their value as jewelers, they go to another line of work, the value of jewelers would fall to zero. What would happen to the value of diamond mines? It would fall to zero. Okay? So it's the value of the subjective value that people attach, okay, on their marginal utility scales to diamonds that's imputed backwards to the diamond mines. People's demands for diamonds fell to zero, you wouldn't have any value of diamond mines. This is why, by the way, the war on drugs doesn't work, because it's fundamentally at war with the value imputation process. The government tries to fight the war on the supply side, yet people, whether we like it or not, value the end product, the drugs. If people value the end products, they're always going to be willing to give other goods to get these end products. In our case, in a money economy, those other goods are money. Okay? So there will always be a demand. So if you fight the war on the supply side, you're fighting this iron law of economics. That is, that value is imputed backwards. If there's a demand, there are going to be people out there that are responding to that demand, that are creating the higher order goods that are necessary to produce the final good. So the only way to fight the drug war is on the demand side. Okay? When people's values change, when, let's say, drugs fall off their value scales and become not a good but a bad, something that they don't believe will satisfy any wants, what will happen to all the drug cartels? What will happen to all the poppy fields? What will happen to all the, the bricks of cocaine and so on? Would they have any value? Of course not. No matter how much you spend at producing these things and transporting them, they wouldn't have any value. Okay? So the war on drugs can't be won on the supply side. Okay? Menger's theory proves this. Okay? Finally, Menger pointed out that in general, higher order goods, the value of higher order goods are derived from the lower order goods and ultimately from consumers. That is, production, objective production goes from higher to lower, meaning that causality runs from the wheat. Okay, you produce the wheat, then you combine it with labor, you produce the flour, and then you combine the flour with bakers and ovens, and that causes the production of the bread, okay, which in turn then causes satisfaction of human wants when the person consumes it. But the value is the causal relationship between value runs the other way. Okay. The last thing I want to mention very quickly is his theory of pricing of the factors of production. I can do this pretty quickly. What about a unit of labor that's used to produce wheat, or a unit of fertilizer? In other words, many different goods are used to produce flour. Okay, or let's take wheat. Many different goods are used to produce wheat. You have labor, you have fertilizer, you have horses and plows and so on. Okay, how do we determine the value of any one of those? It's easy enough to say if the value of 100 sacks of wheat is imputed backwards to all the laborers and horses and plows and fertilizer and land that's used. But how do we determine what portion of the value goes to each one of those concrete units of goods? Menger again came up with a very simple explanation that's based on marginal utility, and that explanation was as follows. He said, let's take the following production function. Now, what a production function is that we list all the factors that are combined together to get the output. So if this is 100 sacks of wheat, this is 90, let's say, days of labor. This is 2 horses, 1 plow, I can't remember what A stood for, but acres, 40 acres, absolutely, and 500, let's say 500 pounds of fertilizer, okay, were used. What's the value of 100 pounds of fertilizer? Let's say it's sold in 100 weight, sold by 100. What's the value? Okay, how can we figure out how to apportion the value of each bushel of wheat to these things, or of all these bushels? Menger said it's very simple. Subtract 100 pounds of fertilizer, and then observe what happens to the amount of the output. Okay, you're still going to be able to grow wheat. It's just that the land won't be as productive. So if you subtract, let's say, 100 pounds of fertilizer, let's say that 10 bushels of wheat, you get 90 bushels instead of 100 bushels. And if the bushel, now he didn't go this far, but if the bushels sell for $3 per bushel, then what's the value of 100 pounds of wheat? What would its price be? Or 100 pounds of fertilizer? $30. Okay? If you subtract 5 hours of labor, you would get what 5 hours of labor gave you. So what Menger said was that the value of any particular complementary good, meaning goods that are used in complement, the value of any particular complementary good is determined by the marginal utility of the wheat, or its marginal product. Okay, he called it the marginal product. Its marginal product. The marginal product was the additional wheat that is produced by adding that 100 pounds of fertilizer to the production process, or that one or by adding that 1 hour of labor to the production process. So we could, so he extended the principle of marginal utility back into production. And in that way, and I can sum it up, in that way, he made economics complete. Okay? He didn't fill in all the gaps. Okay? Later Austrian economists did that. But he gave us an outline of how we would explain value and prices in the real world. Okay? I'll stop here. Thank you.